Welcome, viewers. You're back with Bring the Fact. This time, we will reveal the hidden side of a major event that is currently attracting global attention. The shocking incident at the Allenby Crossing, the critical humanitarian gateway between Jordan and the West Bank. How could a route meant to deliver food and medicine suddenly become the stage for gunfire and chaos? Was this a sign of deeper security flaws, or simply the desperate act of one man? The answers uncover a fragile balance between aid, politics, and survival. But before we dive in, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons. That way, you won't miss the hidden facts we'll reveal next. How could a humanitarian aid crossing suddenly turn into the site of a shocking incident? This was the question echoing across newsrooms and diplomatic circles on September 18, 2025, when violence erupted at the Allenby Crossing, the key border point between the West Bank and Jordan. Known for decades as a fragile lifeline for humanitarian aid and civilian travel, this crossing became the center of global attention after an unexpected and deadly act unfolded at its gates. For many, Allenby Crossing had symbolized a channel of hope, an artery for food, medicine, and daily supplies to pass through toward Palestinian territories. On that day, however, it became a scene of chaos. The day began like many others. Trucks queued under the sharp sun, engines rumbling as drivers prepared to undergo the usual inspections. Among them was a vehicle driven by a Jordanian man, identified later as Abdul Muttalib al-Qaisi. For several months, he had been working as a driver for humanitarian convoys, tasked with transporting aid from Jordan into the occupied territories. The atmosphere at the crossing was tense, as it had always been. Soldiers monitored the lanes, cameras scanned each vehicle, and humanitarian organizations awaited clearance to ensure their goods reached those in need. Yet no one imagined that within minutes the crossing would become a killing ground. According to official reports, as the truck approached the Israeli checkpoint, al-Qaisi suddenly stepped out and opened fire. Witnesses described the sound of gunfire slicing through the air, followed by screams of soldiers caught off guard. 2 Israeli soldiers were killed almost instantly. The shock was immediate, and panic spread through the crossing. Aid workers ducked behind their trucks, others froze in disbelief, while security forces scrambled to respond. It was a moment that seemed to blur the line between humanitarian mission and battlefield. Reports later revealed that when al-Qaisi's rifle malfunctioned, he attempted to continue the assault with a knife. This desperate move underlined the violent intent that had taken root within him, though investigators at that time could find no clear connection to any armed organization. Israeli forces quickly regained control. Shots were fired in response, and al-Qaisi was killed at the scene. Within minutes, the crossing was placed under complete lockdown, sealing off both humanitarian and civilian passage. The news rippled outward with astonishing speed. Israeli authorities labeled the event an act of individual terror, insisting there was no evidence linking the attacker to any known group. On the other side, Jordanian officials confirmed his identity and expressed deep concern, launching an investigation into how such an act could have been carried out by one of their nationals. The government in Amman emphasized that al-Qaisi had only recently been employed as an aid driver, and there had been no prior indication of extremist behavior. For the families of the soldiers, the incident delivered devastating grief. For aid organizations, it was a chilling reminder of the vulnerability of humanitarian corridors. And for diplomats, it reopened difficult conversations about the balance between security and the delivery of aid. The Allenby Crossing, usually a symbol of fragile continuity, was now under scrutiny. Questions emerged about the security procedures that allowed a weapon to pass, about the psychological state of drivers, and about the ripple effects that might follow. The immediate consequence was the closure of the crossing. Israel announced that Allenby would be shut temporarily until further notice. For thousands of Palestinians relying on supplies entering from Jordan, this decision signaled hardship ahead. The crossing, already strained by political tension, was now paralyzed by violence. Food, medical shipments, and other essentials were delayed indefinitely. Humanitarian groups warned of worsening shortages and pleaded for alternative solutions. International reactions soon followed. News agencies across the globe broadcasted the footage of ambulances, flashing sirens, and lines of halted trucks. Commentators framed the event as a turning point, where even aid missions could no longer be separated from the shadows of conflict. The act of one man had disrupted a fragile chain that sustained millions. Yet amid the chaos, both Israel and Jordan attempted to contain escalation, with Amman pledging cooperation in the investigation and Tel Aviv stressing the need for heightened vigilance at crossings. By evening, the Allenby Crossing stood silent. Barriers were locked, soldiers stood watch in double formation, and aid trucks were ordered back across the Jordan River. What began as an ordinary day of humanitarian passage had ended as a headline tragedy. The ripple effects, both humanitarian and political, were only beginning to unfold. On the morning of September 18th, the Allenby Crossing awoke with its usual routine. Long lines of trucks stretched along the bridge, each carrying precious cargo meant for the Palestinian territories. Drivers, many of them Jordanians, smoked cigarettes by their vehicles while waiting for the slow process of inspection. Aid workers shuffled papers, and officials in uniform scanned every document with cold precision. For decades, this crossing had been both a bottleneck and a lifeline. But on this day, the ordinary rhythm was pierced by the sudden crack of gunfire. The man who turned the scene into chaos was later identified as Abdul Muttalib El-Kisi, a 57-year-old Jordanian who had been working only a few months as a truck driver for humanitarian shipments. According to Jordanian records, his background was quiet and unremarkable. No ties to armed factions, no history of criminal behavior. Yet in a single moment, he stepped out of his vehicle, raised a rifle, and pulled the trigger. The bullet struck 2 Israeli soldiers, killing them instantly. Their bodies collapsed on the asphalts, and the checkpoint erupted in panic. Eyewitnesses reported scenes of confusion. Civilians and aid staff dove behind barriers, some running back toward the Jordanian side of the bridge. Israeli troops scrambled for cover, shouting commands in the chaos. In the middle of this, El-Kisi's weapon jammed. What happened next shocked everyone further. He pulled a knife and charged forward, aiming at the nearest soldier. Before he could land a fatal blow, a volley of bullets from Israeli security forces cut him down. His body fell near the very lane where humanitarian convoys usually pass through. The immediate aftermath was suffocating. Israeli authorities declared a lockdown, sealing off the entire crossing. No trucks moved, no civilians passed. The road that once symbolized movement became a frozen corridor of fear. Soldiers blocked journalists from approaching, while helicopters circled overhead. Within minutes, the Allenby Crossing was no longer a gateway of aid, but a militarized zone under full alert. Keyword: lockdown, military checkpoint. News of the attack spread quickly. Israeli military spokesman described it as an act of individual terror, emphasizing that no evidence connected Al-Kisi to any militant group. For Israel, this narrative served to underline the unpredictability of lone wolf attacks, while also justifying tighter restrictions on aid transport. Jordanian officials, on the other hand, expressed shock and regret. They confirmed the identity of the attacker, noted his short employment history, and launched an internal investigation. The Jordanian government stressed that such violence endangered both humanitarian missions and regional stability. As the day turned into evening, the wider consequences of the incident became clear. Israel ordered the complete closure of the Allenby Crossing until further notice. This decision effectively cut off one of the main arteries for humanitarian assistance into the West Bank and Gaza. Aid groups sounded alarms about the impact. Food shipments would be delayed, medical supplies held back, and thousands of civilians left waiting for essential goods. For people already living under blockade conditions, the closure represented yet another tightening of the grip on daily survival. The diplomatic dimension was equally tense. Israel and Jordan share a fragile peace treaty, one that has often been strained by events in the Palestinian territories. The attack threatened to deepen mistrust. While Jordan pledged cooperation in the investigation, Israeli officials privately questioned the screening procedures that allowed a driver to carry weapons into such a sensitive zone. Analysts speculated whether the event would prompt Israel to impose stricter measures on all Jordanian aid convoys, a move that could stall humanitarian operations indefinitely. International coverage framed the attack as a symbol of the region's volatility. Global networks broadcast images of halted aid trucks, grieving families of the soldiers, and statements from both governments. Commentators warned that this incident could set a dangerous precedent, showing how even humanitarian corridors could become targets of violence. Some questioned whether aid crossings could ever remain neutral spaces, or whether the shadow of conflict would always find its way into them. By nightfall, the Allenby Crossing lay in eerie silence. The bridge that had carried thousands of shipments over decades was now lit only by floodlights and guarded by heavily armed troops. Traces of blood stained the checkpoint pavement, quickly washed with water but not erased from memory. For those who depended on the crossing, the silence was terrifying. For governments on both sides, the challenge had only just begun. The crossing had fallen quiet, but the repercussions were echoing far beyond its locked gates.
The shock of the Allenby Crossing attack did not fade overnight. In the days that followed, ripples of consequence spread far beyond the banks of the Jordan River. For Palestinians waiting on aid deliveries, the closure of the crossing was a devastating blow. Trucks loaded with flour, rice, and medicine sat stranded on the Jordanian side, unable to cross. In Gaza and the West Bank, shops reported rising prices, while hospitals quietly warned of looming shortages. What had once been a predictable, if slow, flow of supplies was now choked off entirely. For Israel, the incident reinforced long-standing fears about infiltration. Security analysts highlighted the vulnerability of border points where aid and people moved under delicate arrangements. Military officials reviewed the screening process, considering stricter checks on every driver and every shipment. The attack had shown that even one individual, acting alone, could breach the fragile trust built around humanitarian routes. To Israeli families mourning the two soldiers, the response seemed justified, but for Palestinian civilians and Palestinian towns, it meant another layer of hardship. In Jordan, the government faced its own storm. State media reported the identity of Abdul Muttalib el-Qaisi, while officials condemned his actions as reckless and criminal. Jordanian investigators questioned colleagues, family, and employers to piece together his motivations. They found no record linking him to political or armed movements. To Amman, this presented a troubling reality. How could a man with no known ties commit such a violent act at the center of an aid mission? For Jordan, the attack was more than a crime. It was a diplomatic wound. Diplomatic channels between Israel and Jordan were immediately activated. Delegations exchanged urgent messages, each side careful not to escalate the situation further. Jordan insisted it would cooperate fully, emphasizing its commitment to humanitarian operations and to maintaining the peace agreement. Israel, however, pressed for enhanced vetting of all aid drivers. The tone was cautious but tense. Behind closed doors, officials admitted the event had reopened deep mistrust in a relationship already strained by years of friction over Jerusalem and Palestinian rights. Aid agencies sounded louder alarms as days passed without reopening the crossing. Representatives of international organizations warned that prolonged closure could push vulnerable communities into crisis. For them, the question was not only about politics or security, but about survival. Each day the crossing remained sealed meant fewer supplies for families in need. Humanitarian leaders urged both Israel and Jordan to find a balance between security and access, but their pleas struggled to cut through the noise of politics and fear. The attack also drew reactions from beyond the region. News networks in Europe, America, and Asia carried footage of ambulances and soldiers standing guard at the crossing. Analysts debated whether this was the start of a new trend of violence targeting humanitarian spaces.
Editorials pointed to the fragility of aid corridors in conflict zones, warning that if trust in these routes collapsed, millions would suffer the consequences. On the ground, Palestinians felt the weight of uncertainty. In towns near Jericho, merchants complained that their shelves were emptying faster than usual. Families began rationing supplies, and whispers of black market prices grew louder. For many, the Allenby Crossing was not an abstract diplomatic subject, but the difference between food on the table and hunger. Each closed day deepened frustration, feeding a sense of abandonment and despair. By the end of September, the Allenby Crossing remained under heavy guard. The bridge itself, stretching over the Jordan River, stood silent except for patrols and military vehicles. The atmosphere was heavy with tension, as though the structure itself carried the memory of gunfire. For Israeli soldiers posted there, vigilance was now absolute. For Jordanian drivers, the uncertainty of their livelihood hung like a shadow. And for Palestinian civilians, the locked gates symbolized yet another barrier in a life defined by restrictions. The attack of September 18th was brief in time, but vast in impact. One man's decision had transformed a humanitarian route into a front line of fear, leaving governments scrambling, aid missions paralyzed, and communities bracing for the aftershocks. The crossing that once represented fragile continuity had become a reminder of how quickly violence could sever the lifelines of a region already burdened with conflict.
The Allenby Crossing incident revealed more than just a single violent act. It exposed the fragility of humanitarian corridors, the weight of diplomatic mistrust, and the human cost carried by communities on both sides of the river. What began as an ordinary aid delivery ended with lives lost, borders sealed, and entire populations facing new uncertainty. The silence of the bridge stands as a reminder that in regions marked by conflict, even the most essential lifelines can be severed in an instant. That concludes the series of facts we uncovered today. Don't forget to subscribe to the Bring the Fact channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any other important revelations.